on large-scale agile and traditional programs. He is one of only about 5 focused on government who is certified to train by Dr. Jeff Sutherland, an author of the Agile Manifesto and co-creator of Scrum, the most popular agile framework in the world. A frequent speaker, he has given talks on topics including lean and agile transformations in government, agile metrics, agility at scale, culture change, and using Scrum beyond software. He is currently managing principal for Packaged Agile, a firm focused on effective agility for U.S. government, and he has trained over 1,500 government staff and has been recognized for his contributions to scaled agile certification exams. His favorite quote, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth," is attributed to the underappreciated scholar Mike Tyson. With that, Dave, I'd happy to turn it over to you.
Great. Just a quick sound check. You can hear me okay and see my screen? Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me. We've got a good talk today on Scrum. We all have heard how important it is to build high-performing teams, and I want to teach you a little bit about Scrum and how that works. It is a repeatable process to do just that. So as we're jumping in, I just want to call your attention here to the left of the screen. You'll see we have a quick poll. It's actually just one question. If you wouldn't mind jumping out to packagedagile.com, LIG 2022, right over here. LIG is in lean in government. One question on high-performing teams. We're going to test you a little bit. Don't be worried about getting the wrong answer, but we'll go ahead and get started and give you a second to do that. Let's see. All right, so Josh already gave me an introduction, just a bit more about me. I have been doing government work for over 25 years now. My focus really is increasing the value of what we spend on government. We spend literally trillions of dollars every year between federal, state, and local government. And there's often questions about whether we get sufficient value out of that spending. So that's part of what I try to do by helping build high-performing teams and implementing better agility into government agencies. All right, and if you haven't already, just a reminder to go out to Lean in Government or packagedagile.com, Lean in Government 2022. We had some great Jeopardy music teed up for you that technical issues got in the way. So I'm going to skip a little bit over this, but you can still get the gist, listen in while you fill out that one question at that site. All right, so what are we really doing here? What problem are we trying to solve, right? Many of us really want to power better mission outcomes through agility. We're still, though, primarily focused on individuals as the primary drivers. And what do I mean by that? Well, we say we care about teams, but our actions often suggest we are still focused on individual people. So, for example, we put a bunch of time into hiring the right people, right? We do interviews, we talk to prior jobs, we talk to people who know these people, we do background checks. But when was the last time you put that much effort into evaluating whether you were building an effective team? For many of us, we haven't. We give individual performance reviews, but we don't generally do team performance reviews. Again, there are some exceptions, but most of us don't, right? And if we do some type of a team lesson learned or something, it's often very generic and not nearly as in depth as what we do for individual reviews. We put people onto teams often without considering how many other assignments they already have, right? So I've been in many places where I was thrown onto 5, 6 different teams. So I had 5 or 6 different jobs, 5 or 6 different bosses. And we frankly just don't do a great job when we are split that frequently. We've got concepts called context switching, which come into play. And finally, teams often, unfortunately, obscure responsibility. So while we may have a project manager or a team lead, the reality is they only have so much control over teams because everybody's split into different things most times. And so it's hard to call them accountable when we don't deliver. And unfortunately, that's a really big mistake. And the reason I say that is because in today's world, it's going to be the teams, not the individuals, that are the primary drivers for delivering mission or business value for in the private sector. And here's a couple examples of that. So here's Reid Hoffman. He's the guy who started LinkedIn. And he talks about that, look, if you're playing a solo game, you're always going to lose out to a team. And he doesn't just mean any team here, right? He's talking about high performing teams. There are plenty of poor performing teams out there. He obviously built something that was very high performing and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar business in a fairly short amount of time. But it isn't just the private sector. So some of you may have heard of David Marquet. He is a former commander of the USS Santa Fe, a nuclear submarine, and he wrote a book. He's holding it here called "Turn the Ship Around." And that book is about how he transformed the worst submarine in the fleet to not only the best submarine in the fleet, but after they did some analysis, they came into evaluations. They earned the highest score that a nuclear submarine had ever scored in the Navy, right? So he took them from worst to better than first in a lot of ways. And part of what he didn't use Scrum per se, but a lot of the concepts that he used about empowering people and using autonomy and having people have enough clarity and vision to achieve what he wanted to achieve is a lot of what we do in Scrum. And he expresses the same type of thing. Doesn't matter how smart you are, right? If you've got 135 really smart people who know where you're trying to go, then you're going to crush the competition. A little more quantitative information about that. So many of us are on projects, right? In the government, I mentioned how much money we spend. Some of that is just on client service, customer service, but a lot of it is building new things. It could be new software, new hardware, right? New submarines, whatever it is. We're all involved, a lot of people say, in the software business one way or another. And so here was a little bit of a study that was done a number of years ago. They looked at about 50,000 different projects. And they found out that traditional, or the ways we usually run projects in teams, right? The way we usually build teams and run those projects in a traditional way, sometimes called waterfall, the only about 25%, 26% here were considered successful. A large portion, more than half, were considered challenged. They were late, over budget, they delivered less features than were expected. And then we've got 21%, which is a really scary number. 21% where we invested in our case, government funds, sometimes millions, tens of millions of dollars. In a few cases, I can think of hundreds of millions, where we got nothing out of it. The project was canceled before anything was ever delivered. Lots of high profile cases of this. So Agile and Scrum methods, we'll talk about the difference between agility and Scrum in a minute, do much, much better. We're going to talk about how we work in Scrum and how we build teams, both of those. And they tend to do much, much better. So traditional projects fail more than 250% more than the Agile and Scrum methods. And full successes, right, where we delivered the trifecta. We were on time, on budget, and delivered what was expected, happened about a little bit more than 60% more frequently. All right, so that's great. So there's some evidence that this works, but why don't we do it? Why don't we build high-performing teams already, right? There are literally decades of research out there. The challenge is most people are not going to go out and read a bunch of research papers. And the summaries are not very easy to execute necessarily. So humans, we're going to talk about how this needs to be for humans. Humans are simple creatures. If we make something too complicated, we're often not going to do it. So if we have to read through a bunch of research papers to pull out nuggets, 99% of that is not going to happen. Our solutions then need to be packaged. They need to be put in simple terms and very easy, step 1, 2, 3, in order to do. And part of that is any of those frameworks, Scrum is one of those that we're going to use, needs to deal with our humanity. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we need to take into account that humans make mistakes. That sounds obvious enough. But a lot of the things that we talk about, the ways we work, really assume that we don't. A lot of traditional ways of working. We struggle to communicate clearly, right? We think we were clear about what we said, but somebody else heard something different. We have bad days, even the best of us, even if we're great communicators, we don't always do a great job, we make mistakes. And on teams, this becomes really important. We're afraid to look foolish. Maybe not you, But lots of people you work with, the studies show, often don't speak up because they're worried about their colleagues, what their bosses are going to think of them. We are threatened by change. We say we want changes, but when people try to implement them, we often push back, right? Very common. And then finally, we allow work to fill the time available. All of these are challenges that are not going away. So any framework that we use needs to deal with them. And it's even worse when we put people together. So those are all things that happen at the individual level. If we put 5 or 10 or worse, 20 people together, all those biases, all those challenges are going to be magnified. So we have to deal with that humanness. And that's part of what Scrum is. It gives us a plan to deal with it. Part of what we're going to do is use short time boxes. So we're not going to allow work to grow to fill the time, or we're going to make those boxes short enough, or if it does grow, it's not going to be a problem. We're going to build things in very, very small batches so that we can show it to people and get fast feedback. So we're dealing with miscommunications there. We may make small mistakes, right? But we're going to catch them much more quickly. Some of you, I know a lot of people here understand lean. This looks a lot like a Kanban board, right? We're going to have some kind of a board, make work visible that deals with our humanity. It increases our accountability. And then finally, we are not going to assume that everything we put on paper, even if somebody signs off on it, is going to be right. We know we're going to make mistakes, so we plan on frequent course corrections. And when we talk about agility, that's a lot of what people think about. All right, and that brings us to Scrum. So let's give you a quick definition to start. This is ours. If you look on the internet, you're going to find lots of different definitions. All are reasonable, but frankly, we think this really hits the essence of what Scrum is. It's a simple framework designed to create high-performing teams of humans. And I highlight humans again for a lot of the reasons we just talked about. As much as that's obvious, right, when we say it out loud, the way we design frameworks, the way we put teams together does not account for people's humanness nearly as much as it should. So a little history on Scrum before we dive into the nuts and bolts. Scrum is really a massive research project that's been going on for about 40 years. It gives you an idea of how much time has been invested in looking into that. And it is a research project. We experiment all the time. So Scrum has changed over those 40 years, and we're going to go through a couple of those milestones right here. So here's me. This is actually Dr. Sutherland here, Dr. Jeff Sutherland, one of the two creators. We'll talk a little bit about Jeff. But basically, it started in 1983. Dr. Sutherland was actually in the military. He was a West Point graduate. He flew missions in Vietnam. And when he joined the private sector, he started seeing how poorly teams collaborated, worked together compared to his experience in the military. So he started looking for ways to change and started building what became the foundations of Scrum. People ask about the term Scrum. No, it's not an acronym. Where did it come from? In 1986, there was a paper published called the New Product Development Game. And in that paper was the first reference to Scrum the way it's used here. And it is a rugby term. So it really is talking about when people get together with the ball, they collaborate to push the ball down the field. That's where the term Scrum comes from. Jeff teamed up in 1993. This is again after 10 years or so of research with a gentleman by the name of Ken Schwaber. And the two of them are the names most associated with Scrum. They launched what is closest now to the original Scrum teams in 93. This is building on a lot of that research. The results were excellent. So they couldn't believe how good in some places. So they wanted to tell the world. 1996, they spoke at a conference, the UPSLA conference, and from there, Scrum took off and began being used by literally thousands of teams. And then in 2001, some of you who know a little bit about agility may know that sort of time frame. There were 17, at this point, it was software related experts who got together in Snowbird and created what's called the Agile Manifesto. So I do want to be clear that we'll talk about while that was software focused, that's the roots of Scrum. Scrum is now used in lots of different industries, lots of ways, which is why we highlight that it's really about high performing teams. It has very, very little to do with software specifically. All right. And for those of you who again, do know a little bit about Agile, oftentimes when people say they are using Agile, what they really mean is they're using Scrum. About 66% of people who say, yeah, we use Agile methods are using Scrum, and it's actually more than that, right? So we've got Scrum and Kanban hybrids, Scrum and something called XP hybrids here. So you're really looking at 4 out of 5 people when they're saying, yeah, we use Agile methods, we're using some type of Scrum. All right, so how is it different? How do we work in Scrum that's so different that produces these results? And first, let's look at a picture of what we might do in a traditional project. Doesn't matter what you're building. In this case, it's a boat, okay? But we do projects like this all the time in government. So the customer comes and says, I want this boat. And maybe they even sign off on it, say, this is exactly what I want the boat to look like. Fantastic. So our project management team says, okay, well, we know exactly what that boat's going to look like. So let's go get some wood. And we know we're going to frame it. So we got to cut that wood into lots of pieces. Then we're going to build that frame. And again, we know exactly what the frame should look like because we know what the end product looks like, right? So we deliver it. Let's say it takes maybe 6, 12 months. I don't know how long it takes to build a boat, but that sounds reasonable. Let's say it's a year, right? And at the end of the year, the customer gets their boat. And it's exactly what they asked for, right? They signed off on it. But at the same time, when they get it, they're like, wow, I'm realizing now I'm not sure I needed all this room. And frankly, putting all these sails up, it's a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be, right? It takes a lot of time. I really need a whole crew to man this boat. And it's just too hard for one person. I didn't really envision that. And you can see the customer here sort of dreaming now of what he didn't ask for, right? But he or she really wanted there, that speedboat. So what's different in Scrum? What do we do differently? Well, it works a little bit more like this. We'll talk about the roles, but we have somebody who works with the customer and says, look, talk to me about your intent. What job are you trying to get done? What are you trying to accomplish? And based on that, they say, look, we want to be able to get from island A to island B. And ideally, we want to be able to do that in 10 minutes. Okay. And we, the team, come back and say, okay, understood. How about this? We can actually get you started in 2 weeks. We're going to build something that allow you to get from island A to island B in 2 weeks. It's going to be a little effort and it's going to take, maybe 20, 25 minutes to get over there because, it's our first cut. Are you okay with that? And we talk to the customer, they go, yeah, okay, fine, fine. It's not what we want, but at least we can get started, right? Because remember, getting to this boat here took a year. So what are they doing in the interim? I don't know, but they weren't, whatever it was, either they weren't doing anything, they weren't serving their customers, or it wasn't working very well. So we give them the raft, right? And they're actually like, hey, this is better than we thought. Takes a little longer, but I'm building some muscle. Hey, you know what? This would work a lot better if you just put a sail on it. We're not capturing the wind. Couldn't you just put a simple sail on? Yeah, you know what? We can do that in about a month. So we put the sail on, and in a month and a half, the customer's pretty happy. They're like, I'm getting to island from A to B in maybe 15 minutes. It's actually not too bad. And the customer, though, now that they've worked with it a little bit, they understand it better. And they say, this would be fantastic if I could just sit down. It's a little bit uncomfortable. Do you think you can just build me a seat? We can do that. That's easy. We'll do that for you in about 2 weeks. So now in about 2 months, they're comfortable to getting from island A to island B, let's say in about, 12, 15 minutes. Not perfect. But at this point, our outboard motor comes in, right? We realize they like this so much, they kind of change their vision a little bit. And they say, if you could just throw a motor on this, we'd be pretty darn happy. So we put the motor on. Now they're getting to the island from A to B in about 7 minutes. So we meet the need. It doesn't look anything like this. And then finally, at this point, we've basically met the need, but they're saying, hey, just in case of rain, put this on here, maybe add a second outboard motor. Now we're getting across A to B in about 5 minutes flat. And we have just saved the government, let's say in this case, $5 million, because this is a much simpler solution. It works better. The guy doesn't have to put up and down all these sails. So everybody's happy. This is the essence of how we work in Scrum, and it does assume some of our humanness. It assumes that we don't always know exactly what we want. People can draw it out of us if we're careful, right? And that's part of the job of the Scrum team. And I tell you what, let me, Josh, I cannot see the chat. Something happened when I shared. So let me just ask you to jump in. And, any questions in the chat? Anything we should touch on?
Hi, Dave. There's no questions at this time, but if anyone does have a question, now is a great time to ask it. We are happy to accept them. We'll give it about 30 seconds to see if any come in, but thank you so far. It's been a great presentation.
All right. Well, and keep it going. I'm just going to go ahead and continue then, but we will have some time at the end as well for everybody. So throw your thoughts in the chat, and even if we don't stop again, we will stop at the end and have time to address those. All right. All right. So again, this is largely how we work in Scrum. Scrum can be summed up in what we call 3-5-3. Excuse me, and that we said it had to be simple, right? So we come up with mnemonics to make it simple. Scrum is 3 roles, 5 events, and 3 artifacts. Let's talk about those briefly, and then on the next slides, we're going to go a little bit deeper into those. The 3 roles are called Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Developers. And don't let the word developers throw you. You could call these doers or builders. Again, this started in software, but it has been used now lots of other places. And I'm happy, if you're interested in the end, to give you some very specific examples where it's been used outside of software and government. So 3 roles, 5 events. The sprint, which is just a time box, we'll talk about that. And then sprint planning, daily scrum. Daily scrum is sometimes called a daily stand-up. Some of you may have heard it called. Sprint review and a retrospective. We'll talk about those. And then 3 artifacts we're going to go into on the next slide. A product backlog, a sprint backlog, and then at the end we deliver what we call a product increment. And if you didn't catch all those, don't worry, it's just a highlight. We're going to go into all of them right now. So we talk about how we work. This is with the boat example. This is how we do that, how we iterate. Let's start at the top. So if you look at number 1 up here, the first thing that happens is we have that role called a product owner, and they work a lot with the stakeholders, with the customers, and they try to draw out of them what's the job you're trying to get done, right? So they try to move from the customer saying, I want this sailboat, to really what I want is to be able to get from island A to B within about 12 minutes. They have techniques to help them do that. And from that, then they build what's called a product backlog. It's just a list. And some of you who are familiar with Scrum or Agility may have heard terms like epics, features, stories. It's just a list. So we build a prioritized list that's called a product backlog. If we're going to satisfy the customer's needs, what do we think we need to do? And we know that list is going to change, right? Just like our boat example, it changed over time. So we build a list, we understand it's going to change. We get together with the team. PO is product owner, SM is scrum master, and again, dev team, you could just think of these as doers. We get together in an event called sprint planning, and as an outcome of planning, we talk about what we're going to build over a short period of time called a sprint. We can think of that as 2 weeks. We commit to creating a few items in that backlog over those 2 weeks. Yes, we agree we can get this done. It's not a forced commitment. It is a team chosen commitment, a team agreed commitment. We don't force people to commit to things that they don't think they can do in that time period. And then over that 2-week span, over that sprint, every single day, we get together for 15 minutes or less, and we generally talk about, are there any impediments, any problems in our way that are going to stop us from meeting what we committed to in that sprint planning over the next 2 weeks? If there are problems, we try to resolve them, okay, either in the meeting if it's super quick, or we have some after meetings. And if we need help, that's one of the jobs of the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master will, while the other team members continue to work, they will take ownership for trying to resolve those problems, those impediments. So while everything else in the sprint is focused on delivering what we committed to, backlog refinement is a little bit different. It's in green here. Backlog refinement is about preparing for the next sprint. So we start looking at those items that we think we might be working on in the next sprint, and we talk about them. And we say, do we need to gather any information so that we can commit to them in the next sprint? Do we need to talk to people, some customers, to understand them a little bit better? Do we need to build what we call acceptance criteria so that we know when we're done? What does done really look like? So we spend a little bit of time preparing for the subsequent sprint during every sprint. Finally, at the end of the sprint, the end of the 2 weeks in this case, we have what's called a sprint review. And you can see here, here's a customer. We bring customers in, we bring stakeholders in, we bring lots of interested parties in, and this is where we show them, here's what we've built over the past 2 weeks. Okay, and that's important because we talked about, we know we're not always going to get it right. We need to be able to iterate on it. This allows us to get their feedback and to iterate. And importantly, some of you may have realized, look, we can't build a whole solution in 2 weeks. It's often true. So we need to set their expectations and say, hey, in the past, if you wanted that whole sailboat, now we're going to give you little pieces. So you need to get ready for that and set their expectations. But once you do, it works very, very well. They give you feedback. And sometimes they tell you, no, we don't like what you built, which is fantastic because you've only wasted 2 weeks. In the big boat example, the sailboat example, you could have wasted a whole year, right? Building something that they thought they wanted. But when they saw it, they realized it wasn't exactly what they wanted. So the customer is there. And then finally, we have what we call the sprint retrospective. And the retrospective is just a lessons learned meeting. We get together, you can see there's no customers here. It needs to be a safe environment, psychologically safe environment, where the team can be very honest with one another about, here's what we just did, here's how we worked together, and here's some things that if we did better would work better. So we may say, Jane, you know what, I had to wait on you on this particular document. You committed to getting it to me. You didn't let me know when it was ready. You were actually done, but forgot to let me know. So we ended up losing 2 days in the sprint because of that. So, can we work on that? So we try to have some very honest feedback, make very small adjustments to our process, to how we work. At the end of the sprint, we have what's called a potentially shippable product increment, something that in theory we could ship and the customer could get value to, right? That may be that raft. It may even be a part of that raft. And we may decide it's not ready, even though it's potentially shippable. We think it's ready, it's been reviewed, the customer likes it. We may still decide to bundle it up into a larger release because maybe the customer's not ready for it yet, right? If it were software, maybe we got to do some training in advance. So that's what this incremental release is. We can choose to bundle those items. That is Scrum in a nutshell. And we'll talk a little bit more about the roles in the sprint, but that's how we work. So we build that team that we talked about. We use this process to deal with a lot of those human issues. And the end result is we often get far better products. All right. So we use a lot of terms in there, right? I don't want people to get lost in the terms. So let's talk through those just a little bit more. First, we make a list, right? We call that a backlog. It's just a list. When we prioritize that list, we call it a prioritized backlog. We estimate the work, and the people who are doing the work are the ones who estimate it. We call those estimated backlog items. We plan and commit to doing a small segment of the work. That's what we do in sprint planning. We actually do the work, which we call the sprint. And then at the end, we have 2 ways to review and improve. We have the sprint review with the customer, with the stakeholders to show what we built. And then we have the retrospective, which focuses internal to the team on here's how we work and here's how we can improve how we work. And then we improve. Slide stuck here. A little bit more about the sprint. Again, it's just a mutually agreed time box. And we do it because of what's called Parkinson's Law. You've heard of this. When we say work grows to fill the time available, Parkinson's Law is another name for that. You can choose different lengths for the sprints. Some teams choose 1 week. Some teams choose 3 weeks, 2 weeks is by far the most popular, and it's what we recommend to start with. The beauty with something like Scrum is you can start with a 2-week sprint. We are always iterating, we're trying, we're learning. So if we figure out 2 weeks doesn't work after the first 3 months, we change it. It's part of that experimentation. There's a lot of hidden value to these short sprints. People often don't recognize at first. We've already talked about some. It helps us identify misunderstandings quickly because we get the customer in there, right? They see things. And that's important because people often don't know what they want until they see it or they use it. And this one's really important at the bottom. We talk about wanting to be data driven, right? But how can you be data driven in project management? By the time you get to the end of the project and say, this phase took us this long, here's how many work hours it was, you're basically done. But in Scrum, every 2 weeks, we generate real data on a specific team to say this team can complete about this much work every 2 weeks. It's very fluid for the first 3 to 6 weeks or 3 to 6 sprints, but it starts to stabilize after that. We can make good, realistic projections. So very helpful. What does it look like on a calendar? Well, it might look something like this. For a 2-week sprint, day 1 is sprint planning. Every other day, we have our daily scrums here. At the end, we've got our sprint review where we bring in the customer and show them what we built. And then here's our retrospective, separate meeting, different crew, just our team for the retrospective. And then you can see backlog refinement is here in green. Every team does it a little bit differently. There is no requirement for backlog refinement. You can do it a little bit every single day. You might do it once a sprint. In this case, the team does it about an hour and a half, 3 times per sprint, and that's enough. Again, that's just figuring out, looking at what do we think we're going to work on next sprint and gathering any data and requirements that we think we're going to need to satisfy it. A little bit more about our 3 roles here. First, we have our Scrum Master, and they are experts at the process. They understand a lot about Scrum and building high-performing teams. That's a lot of their job, to help with continuous improvement and improving the quality of the team. The project owner owns the what, as in, here's what we are going to create, what the team is going to build, and they prioritize it. They work 50% with the customer, 50% with the team. And then, we already said, don't get hung up on the term developers. They're often called developers, or they have a development accountability. These are doers, they're builders. If it was software, it could be real developers. It might be testers, it might be business analysts, it might be technical writers, right? But in building that ship, every role who has an action in building that ship is considered a developer. A key for Scrum is accountability as at the team level. So we've got a picture here, right, showing what a lack of team accountability looks like. These guys are just sitting back, right? Maybe they built their part of the ship. They think they're done. These guys here, their part of the ship is sinking, and that's not Scrum, right? So even though we may have a few roles within the team, this is one of the reasons why we try to just give all the team members a unified title, because they need to work together. Even if you are not an expert at building this end of the ship, these guys need help bailing, right? Everybody can bail. So accountability in Scrum is at the team level. Really, really important concept. So this is one of those things that may seem deceptively simple. People are not used to working like this. So it often takes a significant mindset shift. And that's part of what the Scrum Master does, help with that. Where does it work? It works all over the place. Again, because the focus here, and that's why we chose the definition that we did, is that it's really about building high-performing teams of humans. It's not about software, where it started. So it really works anywhere, right? Any domain, any activity where teamwork is helpful or really important. If you're going to be working together with teammates regularly, this gives you a structure to build teams and ways of working that are going to help you be effective that deal with our humanness. See how we're doing on time here. All right, we're going to finish up and take questions in just a moment. People at this point ask, okay, great, you gave us some statistics up front. What can this really do for us? Well, here was one of the bigger studies by the University of Maryland in 2008, and they found these are the average, I think, or median improvements across 300 or something projects that they looked at, cost reductions of 30%, schedule reductions of 70%. Again, it's not because sometimes we work faster, but a lot of it is also because we do less, like that boat example, right? We built a lot less. Productivity improvements over 100%, quality, you name it. So they had a very high return on investment. I will tell you there's lots of different studies, lots of different results, but these are directionally the industry. It's very, very clear at this point. The vast, vast majority of people believe that working in this way can be a humongous improvement. And that's why so many companies over the last 20 years have adapted, again, Scrum or what they'll often call agile methods. All right, and as we're gonna move into a Q&A, do me a favor, take a second, go into the chat now or the Q&A. I can't remember what you're supposed to use. It might be the question section. And tell me, we've gone pretty quickly, right? We've got a limited amount of time today. What else do you think is really important for building a high performing team that we haven't talked about? Obviously, we haven't talked about everything. So use your own experience. What has been really important to you for building a high performing team, or you think that would be? Take a guess and throw it in the chat. We'll give you just a second to do that. I am guessing, Josh, I am hopeful. We have lots of stuff coming to the chat right now. I can't see any of it, but I'm hopeful it's happening.
We currently have a few questions. One person just responded with to your recent question, regular customer feedback.
Outstanding. Yes. So, and this is one that actually is included a little bit. It's not a full solution, but those sprint reviews that we talked about, we really want that regular customer feedback there, and we'll often integrate some type of questionnaire or something that's anonymous as well. So it doesn't completely replace it, but that is one place every sprint we get their feedback.
Additional responses coming in, developing the team.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. That was one of the ones I was hoping for. So completely right. So I think this is one of the biggest, look, we've given you broad strokes here, right? Which is really important to get started. But up on the screen, I've got a few things now that are absolutely key for developing the right team. One is some of you are probably familiar with Amy Edmonston. She is one of the leaders, one of the big voices about psychological safety. Um, we don't have too much time to get into that today, but absolutely critical for high performing teams. They feel safe, right? We talked about the fear of embarrassment in front of your colleagues or your bosses for bringing up questions. Psychological safety is key. That's one of the things that a great Scrum Master will help do. There's also other right team concepts, I call them, like using volunteers. Absolutely critical. You force people into ways of working that they are not comfortable with. I can tell you it just does not work out well. You can invite them, but we can't force them. And then, of course, everybody likes to talk about leadership, right? I don't know if we've got any of those in the chat, Josh.
A few more responses. One, you have executive support for your product or improvement. Another
Boom.
being team members being able to trust each other. And another, getting people out of their swim lanes and to collaborate as a team.
Absolutely. So at least one talked about sort of executive behavior. Huge. We do have, again, some research on this. Certain behaviors, we have lots of leaders who talk a good game and just don't back it up, frankly, right? Maybe they don't know how to back it up. It's not always their fault. But when we get them doing what we need them to do to support these teams, then we can see orders of magnitude improvements in the quality of what works. So again, we don't have a ton of time to get into those today, but I do want to at least give you an idea to get started. Make sure I have time to do this. Yeah, about 5 more minutes. If you wanted to try something like this out, if at least sounds interesting enough to try, start here. And this may seem like a weird place to start, but research shows if you just take 2 minutes and write down what personal goals, the what's in it for me, what personal goals and needs could I meet if I could help do something like this, if I could help try something like this within my agency, right, within my department, that goes a huge way to people actually taking action down the road. So I'd encourage you right after this, before you go get your next cup of coffee, take a break, and just write down 2 or 3 bullets of why this could be useful for you, for your agency, to save money, to give it a try. And then finally, we'll give everybody copies of this. We've got some other ideas we could give you about getting started. A few big ones though: set up time with your leaders, talk to them, right, about some of the statistics involved here. Many of them are probably not aware. And then ask them if they're willing to try a short time-bound experiment. Trying Scrum for 3 to 6 months, maybe not on 100 teams, maybe on 2 teams, right? See how it goes. And I know this seems hard. A lot of you probably feel like, well, I'm not sure I have the right skills to ask. I wouldn't know what to ask. Ask for hope, or help rather. There's lots of great coaches. This is part of what we do, but there's lots of other great coaches out there as well, good Agile and Scrum coaches, and they can relay those statistics. Come with a group as well is great. If you can get some other compadres in this who will get together with you and go to the leadership, there's power in those groups. And that's it. So with that, Josh, I think feel free. You can get a copy of this presentation if you want it. You can reach out to me. But with that, let's take any other questions that we've got.
Sure, and thank you for a great presentation. First question is from Tony. How well is this concept received by teams that have traditionally used other methods of project management? And how do you illuminate the value of switching to Scrum to a new team?
Yeah, I'll say it's definitely very mixed. Some people really like working in traditional methods, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So what we typically do to get a sense is invite them. I'm really big on not forcing people into this. So what we'll often do if we come into a new department, a new agency, is we'll talk to the leader and say, look, let's invite a few teams to apply to try this. Okay. And let's pick the teams that feel like they're the most ready. Or let's build teams. If we identify individuals who were open to trying this, let's build teams using those individuals and then give it a try. And then, frankly, in terms of showing the value, the beauty of this is after 2 weeks, after a few sprints, teams see the value themselves generally. Very few teams go back to traditional ways of working. It's usually that powerful. What else, Josh? Anything else?
Thank you for that. There are several other questions. Also, other responses to your earlier question. Others mentioned team responsibility, utilizing, including, and no hiding. And another mentioned the ability to fail forward and having good team rapport. But additional questions are how can you use this system in a grant cycle, and how can you meet grant requirements while being agile to customer needs?
Right. That one may need a little bit more interactive discussion. So I'm going to try and answer, and it may not hit directly on this. But part of what in a grant process, some of this is just figuring out how to work very visibly. So, and I want to be very clear, if the teamwork needed, if there's lots of individuals who work on individual components and you don't necessarily need to do handoffs and people have different specialties, then this may not be needed. Be very clear about that up front. But so if we've used something like this with something related to grants, where we were evaluating grants, where we had a process. And part of that backlog became, okay, we have these new grant applications, for example. How do we evaluate them? We had lots of them. So part of how we used it was that backlog became those individual applications. We defined our process, and people came in and grabbed the applications, reviewed them, applied certain criteria. They handed them off to the next person, sort of a checklist for quality, a validation. And at the end, we were done. With our customer, we would say, these are the grants that meet the requirements. Here are actually changes. At this point, we were still building that grant system. So we'd say, here are some changes to the grant system that can help us do a better job, making it faster, more efficient to evaluate. If that's not a great example, I need to hear more. So feel free to reach out and email me, and I will be happy to get on the phone with you for 15 minutes and talk through it.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one more question. A gentleman asked thoughts on reallocating resource to work off backlog only versus partial assignment, keeping non-backlog assignments.
Yes, excellent question. So this gets into what we'll talk about with context switching a little bit. I will tell you it is much, much easier, which you may have guessed, if we can focus the team members on one thing together, right? So part of, I think, what you're talking about is that they have some things outside the team that they continue to do. It absolutely can work. I've seen it work. it's harder on the team members. And some people love it, but for most team members, it's just easier if we can have everything in the backlog. And I realize that is often one of the biggest mental changes for, especially for executives, about how we work. We do that transition sometimes slowly, though, so people can start that way. They often find the problems themselves, and then either they pull more into the backlog, or we decide we're going to divide responsibilities. And this people is going to be dedicated to the team, and these over here are going to be dedicated to non-team backlog items.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have one more question if we have time.
I'm game.
Sounds great. And somebody asked, how can I apply these principles in a team that has a lot of individual work?
So I will tell you, it's not as much designed for that. There are other agile methods that I think may be better for that, that just focus on making work visible and making commitments, like Kanban. But it's a lot more about where cooperation is needed. So, and this gets into how we define teams. If it's individual work and they really don't need a lot of help from others, look, you can do it. All you're really going to do is have a backlog, show stuff getting done, and make it visible. But that's not the real strength here. The strength here is when team members really need to support each other day to day, and do that type of thing. So if you are interested in that, we can talk. There's other methods out there like Kanban that I think that may be more worth looking into.
Well, thank you so much for that. There were a couple other questions that we will not have time to get to. If you want to, please do reach out to Dave. He's offered graciously to respond if you reach out to him via email. Thank you, Mr. Wickham, for a wonderful presentation. Also, as a reminder to the group, you will need to log out of this session and back into the keynote track in order to view the next keynote. But thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you continue to enjoy the conference.
Thanks, everyone.